Loneliness and Technology series, which is on thinking loneliness. So I'm delighted to be joined this evening by Dr. Christopher Law, by Professor John Paul Rico, and by Dr. Samantha Hill, who will be kind of offering us three excellent takes on how we might begin to kind of like think, actually kind of philosophize loneliness, and they're kind of drawing on the history of philosophy. So this is really, I'm greatly excited to end this spring series on loneliness and technology with our brilliant guests this evening, who have some exciting forthcoming publications on loneliness that I will leave Chris to introduce in more detail. So Dr. Christopher Law will be kind of chairing the event this evening, and he completed a PhD in comparative literature at Goldsmiths, University of London in 2019. His writing has appeared or is forthcoming in Postmodern Culture, Modern Language Notes, and European Romantic Review, and he currently teaches at the University of Glasgow, in Glasgow Calvin College. So before I hand over to Christopher, I just want to kind of remind you of the basic kind of format for this evening, that the panelists will speak and then there'll be a discussion. Please do put any comments in the chat box as you go, and there'll be time for kind of questions at the end. But whilst everyone is speaking, please do keep yourselves on mute. So that is all for now. Thank you so much, Christopher.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Jess, and thanks very much also to you and to Becky at English Association for your help in putting together these events and this one in particular across the whole series. So yeah, what I'm planning to do is just to give, by way of an introduction, a short paper that's perhaps a little bit strangely more akin to a kind of close reading of a particular text, and I hope that nevertheless this will help us to shed light on some of the topics that we'll be discussing today, and to raise some new questions of its own. So just before, what I'll do is I'll introduce each of the speakers, and yeah, after this kind of introduction, which should take just over 10 minutes or so. To that end, I'm just going to share my screen. There's just a very short PowerPoint, which please, could someone just confirm you can see it okay?
Yes, yes, I can see.
Thanks so much. Okay, so there's just a couple of slides. Yeah. Okay, so let me begin. What do texts look like when they aren't being read? I've thought about this question every so often over the last year, whenever I've been penning for a trip to the library or a bookstore or a pub, as we were just talking about, or anywhere to work and read that would give me access to the written word in a context of sociality or commonality. And this question, what do texts look like when they aren't being read, might also be familiar, especially but not only at the current moment, to anyone who works in archives, or in the archives, as we tend to call them. Anyone who comes across a box that hasn't been opened in months, years, perhaps not since it was first categorized, sealed, and stored away. Thinking about these questions led me to return frequently during the pandemic to a text that strikes me as endlessly fascinating, a short and relatively obscure piece by the German Jewish writer Walter Benjamin entitled simply Weimar. Published in 1928, the three-part text initially revolves around a description of what Benjamin calls the small German town of its title. And in the second part of the text, Benjamin turns to the Goethe and Schiller archive, located in the town, and the neighbouring house that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe used to occupy. The text is interesting to my mind, primarily because it sees Benjamin experimenting with institutional comparisons, which don't in the end quite work out. In Weimar, the archive's sterility and its conservational apparatuses are compared at first to those of a hospital, and Goethe's manuscripts to its flailing patients. In the Goethe and Schiller archive, Benjamin writes, The stairs, rooms, display cases, and bookshelves are all white. There isn't a single square inch where the eye might rest. The manuscripts lie propped up like patients in hospital beds. Rather than a hospital, I should interject, the description of this place first suggested to me nothing other than the white cube of the contemporary art gallery, the kind of place where one might be as likely to be struck by a debilitating boredom as much as by inspiration. In another more pertinent register for today's theme, perhaps, Benjamin's description of the archive's architecture reminded me of another kind of container, namely Immanuel Kant's so-called transcendental aesthetic, his framing of space and time as the pure forms of intuition, the conditions that would make any experience possible in the first place. And the irony of Benjamin's recall, I think, is that in this archive, no intuition actually seems to be possible. The visiting researcher or the worried relative of a patient is unable to orient themselves or to find their bearings in the archives or the hospital's monochrome uniformity. Whatever its spatial validity, however, the simile's introduction no sooner prompts Benjamin to recognize and reflect upon the insufficiency of its temporal logic. Normally, the hospital might be figured as a place of convalescence, or at least of a transition from one state to another, to either health or death. And at this point, we might compare Benjamin's picture of the windowless, sterile archive to a far more famous image of artistic modernity, namely Baudelaire's The Painter of Modern Life, which reads the central figure of Constantin Guise, man of the crowd, as a childlike convalescent, looking out of a window and taking vicarious pleasure in the lives being lived by others. Here in Weimar, however, the archive or hospital is cast as a place where time comes to a standstill for those inside, where the possibility of such transitions from sickness to wellness or from life to death is suspended. So Benjamin first pitches this image and then expresses his doubts. And this is quite a long quote, but I'm just going to read it out because I think it is very pertinent. So here's Benjamin. Whereas a lengthy period of confinement to a sickbed makes people's faces seem spacious and still and turns them into the mirror of impulses that a healthy body would express in decisions, in 1,000 different actions. In short, whereas a sickbed causes a human being to regress to an imitation of themselves, these sheets of paper do not lie around aimlessly in their repositories like patients. The fact that everything which we know today as Goethe's works, and which confronts us consciously and sturdily in countless published volumes, once existed in this unique, fragile, handwritten form, and the fact that what emanated from it can only be the austere, purifying atmosphere which surrounds patients who are dying or recovering, and which is perceptible to the few who are close to them. This is something we do not care to dwell on. But didn't these manuscript sheets likewise find themselves in a crisis? Didn't a shudder run through them, and no one knew whether it was from the proximity of annihilation or that of posthumous fame? And don't they embody the loneliness of poetry and the place where it took stock of itself? And don't its pages include many whose unnameable text rises as a glance or a breath of air from their silent, ravaged features? So, forwarded in a series of rhetorical questions which come across as increasingly breathless, Benjamin's argument, if it can even be called as much, tries to distinguish one crisis from another. This is my reading anyway. Attempts not to collapse poetry and human life into each other, but to hold them apart, taking them for what they are. To think about literary works in their least superficial state requires, like a dying relative who comes to live with us perhaps, an encounter with something we do not care to dwell on, namely the crisis of their materiality and their finitude. But the crisis of poetry, Benjamin seems to say, is different from the one befalling an ill human being. The patient seems like a mere imitation of a prior existence of the person we knew. Benjamin's claim about poetry, however, is that it, unlike a person, has no determinate precedent or successor, thus its loneliness. A poem doesn't regress, or for that matter, progress to anything. Insofar as they are absolutely lonely and absolutely contingent, equally vulnerable to annihilation and to posthumous fame, Goethe's manuscripts can be defined neither by progress nor by decline, but only by the shudder that runs through them, time felt as a directionless vibration, or time lived without its flow, to remember the title of Denise Riley's essay on grief, which Professor Lisa Barretzer spoke about at an earlier event in this series. This shudder, loneliness experienced as a kind of physiological torpor, is manifested in the conclusion of the final sentence, which considers Goethe's poetry as of little more substance than a glance or breath of air that rises from the silent, ravaged features of the manuscripts. And the rhyming vowels of Benjamin's German maybe better capture his willingness to listen to those airy voices. And again, I'm reminded here of an earlier talk in the series where Dr. Jameson Webster considered the psychoanalytic implications of this kind of shortened breath. So in one of the foundational claims of Western literary and aesthetic theory, Immanuel Kant's third critique considered the proliferation of aesthetic ideas, that is, imaginative representations to which no concepts are adequate, to constitute the particular domain of the poetic genius. The true poet, according to Kant, would add, to quote, much that is unnameable to the mechanical matter of poetry, enlivening the form and making it new and historically transmissible. In contrast, Benjamin's identification of poetry's unnameable text undoes the putative distinction between poetry's materiality and its unnameable spirit. So little is it interested in questions of succession, genre, or influence. There's only really text in this scenario, language as something over which we cannot have the last word, something without a fully accessible past or predetermined future. And the archive, it seems, is the place where poetry's simultaneously material and temporal loneliness, its incompatibility with any existing temporal logic, even the conservational logic of the archive that houses it, comes to light. So for a long time, I thought of Weimar as an almost unsurpassable expression of what later literary theorists came to call poetry's materiality. And I still think of this essay as a quiet rejoinder to the forms of authority that both philosophers and literary critics tend to attribute to the archive or to various modes of materialism today. What matters, I think, is that these bundles of poetic matter, the manuscripts, aren't like us. They occupy a different time and a different space than do we humans with our teleological dreams of life and death, authority and presence. When I returned to Weimar, however, after starting to think about loneliness and sociality in the midst of the pandemic, I couldn't help but pick up on how its imagery of respiratory struggle, rather than indexing the difference between the dying and the poetic, might instead point to their painful similarity. Reading this essay during the strange durational time that still characterizes so many people's experiences of the present, I couldn't help question whether Benjamin's curious distinction still runs true. Isn't, after all, the directionless loneliness of poetry something being felt by people across the world today, whether or not their breath becomes short? And denied an ability to account for their own lives and their own deaths, to be surrounded by loved ones as they look forward and backward, don't the dying now occupy the position of unseen archived poems? This sense that the new realities made apparent by COVID-19 might compel us to further deconstruct Benjamin's distinction between the loneliness of poetry and human loneliness has compelled me to think about loneliness anew as a contradiction in Fred Moten's terms. something that might only paradoxically be achieved by its defiance through other forms of sociality, mobility, and commonality. So what are the differences between loneliness, isolation, and solitude? Benjamin here uses the German term Einsamkeit, which maybe is not easily translated as loneliness. Is loneliness solely a human experience or one that can be recognized in other material entities? Is loneliness solely a spatial state, or is it also a temporal one? These are just a few of the questions that prompted this event, and I feel very lucky that we're joined today by two thinkers who've written so generously and productively about these questions and others, both before and during the pandemic. So let me just introduce both speakers first for this evening, and yeah, I'll ask them then to give their papers in turn. So firstly, we'll hear from Dr. Samantha Rose Hill. So Samantha is the Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities, Visiting Assistant Professor of Political Studies at Bard College, and Associate Faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research in New York City and the University of the Underground. Sam is the author of two forthcoming books, Hannah Arendt, a biography, and Hannah Arendt's poems. And she's currently writing a book on loneliness for Yale University Press. And then we'll hear from Professor John Paul Rico. John is Professor of Art History, Comparative Literature, and Queer Theory at the University of Toronto. He's an art historian and queer theorist, especially renowned for his work on Jean-Luc Nancy, on whom he has co-edited the forthcoming special issue of Parallax, which I think we're expecting any day now, entitled Jean-Luc Nancy, Poetics, Politics, and Erotics of Exscription. John is currently completing two monographs, The Intimacy of the Outside, Essays on the Erotic Aesthesis of the Common, and secondly, Extinction Aesthetics, The Collective Afterlife of Things. And John's recent writing has appeared in CR, the New Centennial Review, and Keep Parle, among many other venues, including a wonderful essay on precisely those differences between solitude, isolation, and loneliness. So yeah, let me stop sharing screens, and I'll first pass over to Sam. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was really lovely. I'm tempted to throw my paper over here and propose we talk about Walter Benjamin and the archive for the next hour and a half, because that would make me very happy. And I think you just put a lot on the table in terms of thinking about the poetics of loneliness and the aesthetic experience of loneliness, and how that relates to the materiality of the archive, and perhaps maybe why I'm drawn to the archive, but many others are as well, and what it offers us in terms of thinking. I feel a bit bad to change the tone of the conversation, to bring it to more practical politics, which are never as beautiful. They can't be. So alas. Thank you for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to talk about loneliness. And I wish we were together physically, but I'm very happy that this space has been created. I'm going to talk a little bit about my new work on loneliness, and I'll talk a bit about Hannah Arendt. I'll give a kind of overview of the history of loneliness and some of the ways that the way that we talk about it has changed over time, leading up to Hannah Arendt. And then I'll end with a few thoughts about the research that's being done on loneliness today. But I want to begin by talking a little bit about my experience of writing about loneliness and teaching classes on understanding loneliness for the past few years. I started researching loneliness in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. Loneliness was very much in the news at the time, and I was thinking about existential questions of meaning, the rise of populism in the United States, the continuing drug epidemic, and the rising rates of suicide and depression. And like many people, I was curious to learn about the loneliness epidemic, as it has been called. But the more and more I began reading about loneliness and studying loneliness as a lived experience and as a subject of inquiry, I noticed that something strange began to happen. The more I wrote about loneliness and taught courses on loneliness, the more social my life became. And not because I had somehow figured out how to love solitude less or overcome my loneliness, but because I was suddenly invited to join all kinds of groups for lonely people. I went to loneliness meetups. I was invited to a loneliness Christmas party. I was included on loneliness listservs. I was invited to loneliness conferences, and I was now a part of a loneliness community. And that's when I realized that something strange was going on with the way that we were talking about loneliness, and that loneliness had become something of an industry. The loneliness epidemic, which social science researchers debate the statistical merits of, it's not clear actually whether or not people are lonelier now than they used to be quantitatively, that the loneliness epidemic was just one more thing that was wrong with my life, that it was something that I could cure, that I could overcome, to live a long, healthy, happy life. And the more and more I thought about this, and the more and more I read what was being written about loneliness in popular literature, in the self-help aisle, and in newspapers, I realized that loneliness had taken up a life of its own in becoming the purview of medical health experts. And so I wanted to understand what loneliness was, how it had been written about over time, how that had changed, and how we got to this understanding of loneliness that we have today. So what is the myth of loneliness that's being spun? In 2018, the New York Times declared, "Loneliness is tearing America apart." The Economist announced, "Loneliness is the leprosy of the 21st century." The Prime Minister of Great Britain appointed a Minister of Loneliness. The University of California, Los Angeles created a loneliness scale to measure people's loneliness. The former United States Attorney General wrote a book about loneliness. Today, a search of loneliness reveals 4 million news items, mostly a series of diagnostic instruments and self-help suggestions, signs and symptoms of chronic loneliness, how to manage your loneliness. If you're starting to feel lonely, watch this. 10 things to do if you're feeling lonely. The secret to not being lonely. We tend to think of loneliness as something to be ashamed of, a public health problem, or some kind of ahistorical phenomena. But a quick look at the work on loneliness today, and one is convinced that loneliness is evil. It has to be cured. It's something that must be overcome. And most popular pieces on loneliness begin the same way, offering a laundry list of why loneliness is bad. The mortality risk can be compared to smoking 10 to 15 cigarettes a day. Loneliness has a greater impact on the body than obesity or physical activity. Loneliness affects blood pressure and the immune system. Loneliness causes an increase in stress hormones. Loneliness increases the risk of dementia. Loneliness weakens cognitive faculties over time. Lonely people experience lower sleep quality. Lonely people wake more often in the night. Loneliness speeds up aging. Loneliness has taken on a life of its own in our imaginations, a Frankenstein invention of the modern era that must be defeated. We pathologize loneliness even when we're trying to depathologize it, which has the counterproductive effect of making one feel ashamed and fearful of experiencing loneliness. And what is worse, perhaps, is that loneliness is now treated as something that can be ameliorated through lifestyle choices. Make new friends, try new hobbies, buy this, get a dog, get married. But all of these narratives about loneliness miss what loneliness is. an ordinary experience of the human condition. And it is precisely the ordinary character of loneliness that makes us so vulnerable to its uses and effects. The common way of talking about the so-called loneliness epidemic today misses the underlying cause of loneliness from antiquity to modernity: social connection. It is our condition of plurality, of being with others in the world, that is the cause of our loneliness. The fact that we can never get the other nearer to us, and yet we exist in the world with others. The history of loneliness shows us how the way we talk about loneliness has dramatically changed over time. In English, as a word, loneliness is relatively new. One of the first uses was in William Shakespeare's tragedy, Hamlet, which was written around 1600. Polonius beseeches Ophelia, "Read on this book, that show of such an exercise may color your loneliness." He's counseling her to read from a prayer book so that nobody will be suspicious of why she's sitting alone in a room. Throughout the 16th century, loneliness was often evoked in sermons to frighten churchgoers from sin. People were asked to imagine themselves in lonely places, such as hell or the grave. And well into the 17th century, the word was still rarely used. In 1674, the English naturalist John Ray included loneliness in a list of infrequently used words and defined it in terms to describe places and people far from neighbors. A century later, the word hadn't changed much, and in Samuel Johnson's A Dictionary of the English Language, which was published in 1755, he described the adjective lonely in terms of the state of being alone: the lonely fox, or to be in a deserted place on the lonely rocks. Until the 19th century, loneliness most commonly referred to an action: crossing a threshold, journeying to a place outside the city, leaving one's home to venture off into the world, and it had less to do with a feeling. Descriptions of loneliness and abandonment were used also to rouse terror of non-existence within men, to get them to imagine absolute isolation, cut off primarily from God's love. In the 19th century, the way that we understand loneliness begins to change amidst modernity. Loneliness loses its connection with religion and begins to be associated with secular feelings of alienation. The use of the term begins to increase sharply after 1800 with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution, and continued to climb until the 1900s, until it leveled off, rising again during the first decades of the 21st century. And I trace this in what I'm working on, I'll say, since Benjamin was evoked, to Edgar Allan Poe's short story, which invented the detective novel genre. And of course, the detective is one of the characters of loneliness that we often encounter in literature. But that text, Crowds, became a fundamental text for the works on crowds and power and the social dynamics of alienation and the individual in the crowd, which Benjamin picks up on in Poe and Baudelaire. In the middle of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt approaches loneliness a bit differently, moving away from the secular narratives of alienation, putting her own spin on it. For her, it was both something that could be done and something that was experienced by people. In the 1950s, as she was working on The Human Condition, which was to be a book about Marx, and she's writing at the height of McCarthyism, she starts to think about the relationship between loneliness in relationship to ideology and terror. And Arendt thought the experience of loneliness itself had fundamentally changed under the conditions of totalitarianism, which had phenomenally emerged in the middle of the 20th century. One of her more well-cited quotes is, "What prepares men for totalitarian domination and the non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century. So I want to just pause for a second also and point out that Hannah Arendt draws a distinction here in her work between solitude, loneliness, and isolation. And she, as she often does, is playing with vocabulary, and she's taking her vocabulary ultimately from Nietzsche and Zarathustra to think about the condition of loneliness under conditions of totalitarianism. But it goes through several evolutions as she's working on this text. And it's worth pointing out that she's actually in conversation with David Reisman about his book, The Lonely Crowd, while she's writing. But the word for solitude that she uses is the word that Chris just cited, Einsamkeit. And she uses the German word Verlassenheit for loneliness, isolation. But Verlassenheit in German is different than the way that we colloquially might use loneliness. And it means, in translation, abandonnedness, a sense of abandonnedness. So the three underlying existential conditions of the emergence of totalitarianism for Hannah Arendt in Origins, which she had initially published in 1951, were homelessness, rootlessness, and loneliness, or abandonnedness. And these correlate to questions of meaning and thinking for her. So in the Origins of Totalitarianism, she's describing how the experience of loneliness, in the way that she's understanding it in the 20th century, was transformed from an occasional occurrence into an experience of everyday life. And she describes this new form of loneliness as organized loneliness. And I'll just say again, she doesn't give an affective account of loneliness. And that's probably funny to those of you who know Arendt well, because she did not write about feelings. She thought the passions had nothing to do with politics, right? So we're not talking about the affective experience of loneliness when we're talking about Hannah Arendt's conception of organized loneliness. Organized loneliness is a political form of loneliness. And she argued that this political form of organized loneliness is the underlying ground for all totalitarian movements. Political leaders had found a way to transform the everyday experience of loneliness into a mass phenomena through the use of political propaganda, primarily by destroying people's relationship with reality, by teaching them that they can't trust their own sensual perceptions of the world and their own self-reflective thinking processes. And so for Arendt, loneliness, organized loneliness, and the way that she describes it at the end of Origins is about thinking. Loneliness represents for her a standstill in thinking, where the active process of thinking itself is replaced by stagnant and fearful thought. So organized loneliness is characterized, she describes, by a kind of cynicism that leads people down rabbit holes of thought, always deducing the worst while convincing them that there is a truer and truer reality. Conditions people to believe that there is always something else hiding behind the common sense reality of everyday life. And she says that once you can destroy a person's relationship with themselves so that they no longer trust their own sensual perception of reality or ability to think, that you have completely isolated them against one another so that everybody is constantly fearful of everyone else. And this is one of the defining characteristics of tyranny and totalitarianism for Arendt. So we see, I'll just say, this form of political organized loneliness today, not in the emergence of a totalitarian regime, but in the emergence of QAnon, of online internet conspiracy theory groups, of members of the Republican Party in the United States rejecting the facts of science in the face of a deadly pandemic because they know what's true and the scientists don't. And we see how this form of organized political loneliness, which is fundamentally isolating, is a problem for democracy. And So whereas loneliness in the history of literature, as far as I've been able to trace it, is often correlated to movement, to venturing out into the world, to leaving one's home, to experiencing loneliness, which has to do with meaning. For Arendt, she turns it, and loneliness is about isolation. It's about the absence of movement in thinking, and the absence of movement in the world. And she describes totalitarianism as the iron band. So I want to just say a couple of things about how this is starting to unfold in the way that we think about loneliness today. Since Hannah Arendt's work, social scientists have approached loneliness as a social phenomenon in a similar vein, which has led to a near complete collapse between social isolation and loneliness. Today, the two terms are practically synonymous with one another in social discourse. I think that has to do in part with the fact that loneliness is a much sexier word than the brute reality of social isolation. But these are different experiences. A person can be isolated without being lonely, and a person can be lonely without being isolated. And in fact, some isolation is necessary, as some of us know, for writing, for doing research, and for creative processes. So there's this dominant tendency to think that aloneness and isolation are the same as loneliness, but we have to break this apart. And we see this looking at the literature on loneliness today, which presents us with a very clear paradox. People report feeling lonelier in greater numbers today, according to the loneliness epidemic. And at the same time, people are more social than ever. And the more social people are, the more likely they are to feel lonely. So according to Daniel Russell, who created the UCLA loneliness scale, he says that this is in part because loneliness occurs when the individual's relationships with others do not meet expectations. So it's not about the quantity, but it's about the expectations that we bring into our relationships with others that lead to that feeling of disconnect and loneliness. But so feelings of loneliness for him have more to do with expectations. One of the most commonly cited arguments is that Americans are lonelier today because of declining social networks. And this argument was first popularized by Bob Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, which has been widely debunked within social science literature, but not in mainstream discourse. So even when Putnam was writing, civic participation had not declined or decreased. And in fact, it has remained relatively stable over time. But the other side of that is that it's also not true that social media engagement necessarily decreases things like civic participation. If you look at Pew Research Center polls, people who engage in social media platforms are much more likely to be civically engaged and participate in a protest action or political action in the physical world. So we're not more socially isolated than we used to be. It's that our social groups have changed dramatically, and the way that we think about the social and what socializing is has changed dramatically. So social media is obviously a form of sociability, and we need to rethink what it means to be social in order to talk about loneliness, which we feel most sharply in the company of others. Part of the problem is we're spending time in the company of others, as we are right now, in very different ways than we used to. So even if the increasing use of social media means we're alone together, as Sherry Turkle argues, we are still together with others when we're alone. And so where I'm going to take this is to solitude, to bring it back to Arendt, because loneliness and solitude are about thinking. The other side of the loneliness paradox is the side of solitude. That even when we're alone with ourselves, we're not really alone. In part because social media, in part because our digital devices are always within arm's reach. All we have to do is turn on the internet, open the computer, reach for our phone to suddenly feel connected to something outside of ourselves. Very few of us actually spend real alone time together with ourselves, cut off from these forms of digital connection to the outside world. And as Arendt wrote, we need time to be alone with ourselves because solitude, unlike loneliness, is the condition of pleasurably keeping oneself company. And it's in the space of solitude that we have the ability to retreat from the demands of social and public life and nourish ourselves and reconstitute ourselves as individual beings. So the loss of solitude to sociability means that we're losing the ability to make meaning in our lives for ourselves, which also means that we're experiencing loneliness more frequently. At the same time, we are constantly inundated with the world and with the lives of others. One of my favorite statistics comes from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, which cites that the average American spends about 17 minutes a day thinking. Now, what they mean by thinking, I have no idea. I've written to them. They don't have a good answer. I'm not sure, how people, I'm very curious how people read that question, what it means for them to be thinking. But it's not a surprise that meditation and wellness is $1 billion industry, which the loneliness epidemic is now a key part of. People are literally paying billions of dollars a year to learn how to be alone with themselves, how to think alone by themselves, and how to unplug from the world. You can constantly pay for apps to disconnect you. So what is my point with all of this? And I will sum it up because I'm sure I'm over my 20 minutes. The experience of loneliness is not going away. We cannot cure loneliness. Loneliness is a part of the human condition. As I say to my students, if you didn't experience loneliness from time to time, then something might be wrong with you. Loneliness touches upon the most fundamental questions of human life. Who am I? Why am I here? What is the meaning of life? And how should I live? And loneliness is experienced, often painfully, as a heightened sense of self-consciousness. It makes us aware of the immediacy of ourselves, of how we exist in the world in relationship to others, and our own mortality. And in this way, we can approach the experience of loneliness not as a disease, but as an ethical exercise that gives us an opportunity to reshape meaning in our lives. And this is in part why loneliness is often so uncomfortable and terrifying. If solitude is the pleasant experience of keeping company with oneself in harmony, loneliness is the act of radically calling oneself into question, reminding us that we exist in the world with others, and that even though we exist in the world with others, as individuals, we exist alone. And instead of trying to overcome this space that exists between us, we must find a way to embrace this space and this experience of loneliness and nourish it so that we can form meaningful human connections to ourselves and others.
Thank you so much, Sam. Yeah, let's well, we can move on to the next paper from John, and then we'll have time to take questions at the end. So yeah, I'll pass straight over to John Rico.
Okay, thanks, Chris. What a pleasure to hear both your presentation and Sam's. I'm going to share my screen. You can see that? Okay. Since the end of February last year, when I posted my first short text on the pandemic titled Viral Intrusions and Other Friendships, it was a response to Jean-Luc Nancy's own first response to Giorgio Agamben's own first published statement on the pandemic. The Agamben text was titled The Invention of a Pandemic. So over more than a year now, I've been immersed in thinking, reading, and writing about solitude. Through podcast interviews, online lectures, seminars, webinars, journal essays, e-publications, and conference presentations, it's been my good fortune to have multiple and various outlets, certainly most especially this one, in which to present my ideas on the impotentiality, the resistance, and what I call the dark hope of solitude, distinct from isolation and loneliness. In my presentation today, as well as in most of my prior interventions, two of my principal guides have been Hannah Arendt and Giorgio Agamben. As Sam has already discussed, Arendt is the philosopher who has most clearly identified the political basis and ramifications of isolation, most extensively taken up in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. The question of isolation as well as loneliness is, for Arendt, the question of modern mass society, the atomization of individuals, which she argued is the condition for their totalization in the form of mass movement. It is this seemingly oxymoronic mass isolation that I see as the reality created in large part by governmental responses to the pandemic, and that have led to a common way of living, which was reflected in the subtitle of a recent essay of mine. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought us too close together. In her study of totalitarianism, Arendt makes clear that mass isolation leads to mass movement, and that mass movement leads to mass extermination. In order to prevent genocide, death camps, refugees, and mass incarceration, it is the atomization of individuals, in other words, a kind of brutal, violent isolation that must be resisted and abolished. One way to begin to do this, according to Arendt, is to address the anxiety, fear, despair, and sense of worthlessness that plagues so many people, and that in the present day has led to various forms of addiction, or what medical diagnostics now refers to as failure to thrive. It is this general loss of interest in one's life, leading to either what Arendt described as self-centered bitterness or self-sacrificial suicide. It is this that has come to define the social and political reality of societies such as the United States, and that has led to forms of negative solidarity, such as those vividly exhibited on January 6th of this year in the violent seizure of the US Capitol building by the Trump mob. It is in direct opposition to this negative solidarity and its basis in isolation that I have been thinking about the relations between solitude and solidarity. With echoes of Hannah Arendt's ethics and politics of the in-between circulating around it, I opened that essay from last year with the proposition that in addition to political, economic, and biopolitical concerns, the pandemic has also raised a third set of concerns that neither of these other two can entirely explain. As I wrote, it is something more ominous because it is more fundamental. The destruction of the space of separation between us, which is the space of the ethical decision and solidarity. It is also, I would now add, the space that remains open to the extent that it is allowed to be sustained as the time that remains. Like Hannah Arendt, I too firmly believe that the destruction of this shared space of separation results not only in feelings of loneliness, existential and perhaps even ontological isolation, all of which can easily lead to mass isolation, mass movement, and mass extermination, but that such destruction portends the end of the world, human and perhaps inhuman as well. To the question, what would a world look like? Artist Jean-Michel Basquiat answered, just any person. Hearing in the simplicity of Basquiat's response an acknowledgement of sheer minimal existence, we might also recognize a non-mythologizing statement of non-mythical justice, the justice of just, of the non-judgmental rapport with singularity, with just this, a phrase homonymous with justice, that speaks to the minor immanence of what is just, and that is distinct from the complacency of what just is. As in the singular solitude of a thing, and of a world that might consist for each of us as nothing more or less than just a person, in the singularity of our existences. My argument here is quite simple. In the midst of the isolation and loneliness that has become the conditions of living for so many people today, it is imperative that we collectively not confuse either of these states or affects with solitude. For unlike isolation and loneliness, at least in their respective negative shadings, of course, there are ways to think more positively, as Sam eloquently laid out, solitude is the name not only for a state of retreat, but also names what of existence in the singularity of its finitude remains inappropriable and incommensurable. Sharing and a sense of the common are wholly predicated upon this inappropriability and incommensurability of solitude. And it is in these ways that we can come to think and speak of solitude and things as the time that remains. The time that remains is what of time and temporality remains inappropriable, and what renders each thing in the singularity of its existence incommensurable to each and every other thing. Distinct from chronos and ion, the time that remains is the kairos moment, the time of the now as the time that is left for us, the temporality that we are, this time and none other. In remaining, time passes, and in passing, time remains. In his 1982 essay titled Se or Se, Hegel's Absolute and Heidegger's Ereignis, included in the collection Potentialities, Giorgio Agamben points out that, quote, Hegel's thought is one of the supreme attempts of philosophy to think its own supreme thought. Humankind's entry into its se, into its being without a nominative, which constitutes its dwelling and its ethos, its solitude and its consuetude, its separation, but also its solidarity. In the context of this talk, I'm less interested in Agamben's casting of Hegel's thought than I am in Agamben's identification, articulation, and as you can see here, retaining the original italicized format, this italicized enunciation of solitude and solidarity. Se or se is the reflexive without a nominative, without a subject or object. A prefix that is not a prefix since it is not fixed before anything. We might say that se is the pure or absolute resemblance of self, precisely as not resembling anything, something like Maurice Blanchot's notion of essential solitude. To this separation and solidarity, to this solitude and consuetude, consuetude as in habit, I add finitude, which I take to be the force that rhythmically modulates each of these dispositions and expositions of existence. The way in which, as Leo Bersani might put it, the self, the se, is choreographed into being. Okay, that's a black slide.
John, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think that the slides are not, we're still on the very first slide for some reason.
Oh, is that right? They're not advancing.
Maybe, I wonder if it's worth just trying once more.
Let me try once more. Do you see a black screen now?
Yes.
No. Yeah. Do you see the quote there? No.
I don't, I'm afraid, no.
Okay, that's interesting. I wonder why it's not showing up. This worked when we first met to try it out, and now it's not.
If you want to send it to Chris or myself, we can perhaps give it a go.
Okay, let me try one more time. Can you see it here? No.
No.
Okay, interesting.
Elspeth is saying it's a dual monitor problem.
It's what?
She's saying that it's a dual monitor problem. Perhaps it will work if you take it out of presentation mode. I do.
I unplugged my other monitor, so I just have my laptop open. I did that precisely to try to avoid this, but let's see. Yes, no.
Yeah, so.
That works?
Yeah, I think so. If you go to the next, yeah, perfect.
Okay. And now dark screen, okay.
Yeah, sorry, John, I didn't realize until you actually referred to the PowerPoint that, that you would be clicking through.
No, this has happened before, and I can't really explain why. A Zoom mystery. Okay. Choreographed into being. Such an ethos disposition is not the movement for the better, some kind of liberal progress, or the law of movement that Hannah Arendt critically analyzed as the novel form of government that unites ideology and terror. Rather, it is the idiorhythmic resonance of homo tantum, or the errant monadism of Fernand Delaney's autistic children. Or, to jump species, it is the silkworm's ecstatic solitude, a figure of animal captivation that Roland Barthes returned to on more than one occasion in order to think the pleasurable use of one's body. In the case of the silkworm, it is in being nestled and enclosed in its self-spun cocoon that the creature works and glows with all its desire and comes to invent silk thread. This queer monadism is not a dead end, but a dwelling in the inappropriable as justice. The impropriety of solitude lies in the self's essential expropriation, its vocation and way of being in the world. That is to say, in that self's rapport with what refuses itself, and in relation with the lost thing, res amisa, that is the title of the collection of poems by the Italian poet Giorgio Caproni, for which Agamben's essay titled Expropriated Manner originally served as preface. Caproni regards the lost thing as the good. As such, the lost thing might be what Jacques Philippe in his recent book theorizes as the last thing. And it is the lost or last thing that I am thinking of as the time that remains. Given existence's radical non-transcendence, its thisness or heicity, to retreat is always to retreat, not out of, but back into the world, such that, as Jacques Derrida stated at the very outset of his second seminar on the beast and the sovereign, quote, we are always talking about the world when we talk about solitude. As Derrida makes clear, being alone is never not a rapport with, and this rapport is heard in the very enunciation, I am alone, regardless of whether this bare minimum expression of solitary existence is said to oneself or to another, especially since in both cases of address, I am alone is also at the same time effectively saying, yet without coming right out and saying it, I am alone with you. with you being either the me that is saying I, of I am alone, or you as the other to whom the you might also be pointing. At once with you and without you, solitude is the shared sense of being in the world and infinitude. And this is why solitude is a wholly ethical comportment. This is one of the many philosophical takeaways of Derrida's seminar and his reading of Heidegger's own seminar from 1929-30 on titled The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, World, Finitude, Solitude. In turn, when Basquiat defines the world as just a person, let it be understood that that person is the figure and existential instantiation of finitude and solitude. A comportment and not an operative instrument, utility, or law. Solitude is the time that remains in the midst and wake of the coming and going, the appearing, disappearing, and unarrestable passing of other finite existences in the world. It is in this way that a thinking of solitude marks a shift from crisis to crisis. That is, from end-driven apocalypticism to use, crisis, as in the free and common use of the time that remains. Through this, we can begin to understand the solitary as that which is not the sacred, that is not the abandoned, the excluded inclusion, but instead is that which is infinitely separated in the singularity of its finitude, which at the same time is to say, in its touch, its contact, and always already contaminating relation with other things. Hence, my thinking of solitude is opposite to any idealization, moralization, sublimation, or redemption. Instead, it is about singular existence left to its own, that is, its inappropriable death, something that millions of people in the world are deprived of every year. While the majority of Giorgio Agamben's written interventions in the pandemic discourse over the past year have been, I think, widely off the mark, he is nonetheless wholly justified in his moral outrage over the fact that so many people have died in the past year, who have died in the past year, have been left to die alone, in isolation, away from any and all friends and family. Those dying have been deprived of the time that remains and the chance to spend their last remaining moments of life with others whom they love. In this rendering of naked bare life in a state of exception instituted by the biosecurity state, we encounter the exact opposite of the just solitude that I am wanting to think through. It is only in the affirmation of the other in their solitude, in their as suchness, in their being alone, in other words, relating to them non-coercively and not leaving them alone, that is, abandoned to a state of isolation and loneliness, that the other singularity is ethically sustained. Who does death belong to? In a marvelous recent article in the London Review of Books, Jacqueline Rose poses this question within the context of her discussion of Freud's theory of the death drive and the degree to which the death of his daughter, Sophie, who died during her third pregnancy from complications arising from the Spanish flu on the 4th of March, 1918, informed the revelation that startled Freud, which he would go on to describe and elaborate in Beyond the Pleasure Principle of 1920. The solitude of dying one's own death is, as Rose attests, quote, not the same thing as to die alone in a world that seems deserted. In returning to Freud's slightly earlier essay, Thoughts for the Time on War and Death of 1915, she finds a notion of the solidarity that is shared in the non-isolated solitude of death, a notion, I might add, that is far from unique to Freud. If philosophy is the practice and art of learning how to die, we pursue philosophy always in rapport with the death of the other. This other need not, and indeed must not, be limited to the known or familiar other, the friend, the family member, the lover, but must include the stranger, the unknown, and the essentially anonymous other. It is the other's death that teaches us how to die, not as any form of mimetic resemblance or reproduction of the other's death, but in terms of our own singular death vis-a-vis the singular finitude and death of the other. In rapport with the solitude of the other's death, one is returned to one's own singular solitude and sense of finitude. Therein lies a rapport with what of existence is inappropriable, an ethics of finitude, of shared separation, such that whenever we speak in the name of justice, we are speaking of and from a solidarity of solitudes. World, finitude, solitude. Those three terms are not only the fundamental concepts of Heidegger's metaphysics, but they are also inextricably the fundaments of ethical solidarity. Okay, how much time do I have?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe another 5 minutes or so. Is that?
Okay,
Yeah.
then I'll try to make this brief and just show you turning to what I see as equally ethical and aesthetic confrontations with solitude and things, but now introducing the dimension of the erotic. I turn to recent work by the Berlin-based artist Dean Samshima. Taken at various points over the past year in the city of Berlin, his two photo series, Being Alone, this is one of the photos from that series, and Zu verschenken, or to give away, these two series together enable us to conceptualize a queer ethos and erotics of finitude, in which being alone at a sex club or the leaving of things for the taking on city sidewalks prove to be existential and empirical affirmations of the sense of time as only ever the time that remains. In the indefinite waiting that can make the solitude of cruising ecstatic, and in the abandonment of extraneous possessions, one discovers a temporality of queer immanence as here, now, this. Not a historical looking backward, not an infinite progress towards some utopian future, and not exactly no future either. This is queer temporality as the jouissance of the present, to borrow a phrase from Jean-Luc Nancy, not succession, inheritance, duration, or becoming, but interruption, disinheritance, cessation, and unbecoming. Okay, being sensitive to the time we have left, I think I'll jump to the last paragraph in order to wrap up. The anonymous bodies and anomalous things that we see in Samshima's photos point to ontology as not only singular plural, but equally as singular impersonal. Such an ontology finds its ethical disposition in a queer erotic aesthetics, in which two tendencies are conjoined, a radically impersonal sexual appetite and an attention to specific qualities and details in anonymous others and things. This free use and anonymous commerce, this profanation, is one of the things that one of the books I'm currently completing is attempting to theorize as the intimacy of the outside. Following Agamben, profanation is to use without appropriating or possessing, rendering the thing, place, or action inoperative, unprofitable, unbecoming. Profanation is there in the minor detail, where reasons end, and when time is lived without its flow. Such a profane queer ethos and its vocation to sheer unintelligible empiricism is what it means to love, that at least two adjectives of the ontological are finite and unbecoming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Let me just again say thanks to Sam and John together for two amazing papers. So we have just about 20 minutes or so for questions. If you would like to raise a question, if you could either just mention either feel free to type the question into the chat or mention in the chat box that you would like to ask a question, or you can use the raise hand feature on Zoom. Maybe I could begin just by asking a question just for both Sam and John, or something to respond to. So I suppose one thing that I became quite interested in, actually having read your piece, Sam, in Ion about loneliness. Sorry to quote it back to you, it's a bit horrible, but there you say you write this, like language fails to capture loneliness because loneliness is a universal term that applies to a particular experience. Everybody experiences loneliness, but they experience it differently. In your paper, you discuss obviously the fact that the kind of language about loneliness tends to coalesce into these very specific paradigms, I suppose, either kind of medical or almost related to self-help or kind of self-narrativizing and self-narrating. And so I was wondering about, maybe just posing that question to both you and John. I suppose you both began to think about other forms of expression that might pertain to loneliness, either literary or non-linguistic. I was just wondering if you could both say something about that question, like what's the relation between language and loneliness, if the kind of philosophical concept of loneliness as a generality is always insufficient.
Thank you. I think maybe a good way to start responding is one of the things that John spoke about toward the beginning of his presentation, which it was in many ways where I ended, is on the need to talk about the individual and the space between us, the interessa, and nourishing that instead of collapsing that space, and all of the different myriad of ways in which that space gets collapsed. But I think that's part of a response. The other is, when I started working on loneliness, something else happened, which is people would say, "What are you writing about now? What's your new project?" And I would say, "I'm writing a book about loneliness." And everyone from my family to complete strangers would say to me, "You don't understand loneliness. I know what loneliness is. Let me tell you and what my loneliness is." And everybody wanted to share their loneliness with me and to tell me what loneliness was like for them. And I love that. I love that that happens and that it keeps happening. And it's such a particular experience that we have, whether we are alone by ourselves or whether we are in a group with other people. The experience of loneliness can appear at any time. Often in poetry, loneliness is actually personified as a person. Tom Wolfe talks about loneliness as a comrade, the most constant comrade of his life, and it's felt to be a kind of presence. And I think another way to describe it would be that sense we have when we're with another and we feel ourselves receding into ourselves, and we're suddenly aware of the space that exists between us and we're no longer fully present, which can be very jarring as well. Loneliness is a word. loneliness linguistically is a conceptual term that is used to name an affective and experience that we have that's very intimate, that's very personal. And in that way, it does fail because it can't capture what it is that each of us experiences in the intimacy of our loneliness. And I think we need a much richer vocabulary to talk about loneliness today. And this is one of the losses of loneliness becoming the purview of medical experts and self-help experts, is that we need a much richer humanities language to humanize the experience of loneliness. So it's not seen as something that is unnecessary, that's evil, that's hurtful. And to find a way to, talk about how even uncomfortable experiences that can feel uncomfortable, painful, alienating to ourselves are not inherently bad. There are all sorts of moral claims that are being cast at loneliness as well. And I really want to attend to loneliness as an experience of the human condition that presents us with ethical opportunities to confront existential questions of meaning in our lives instead of running away from it. Because people run away from loneliness in all sorts of different ways. But what would happen if we signified the meaning of loneliness so that it was something we could confront and form a relationship with and embrace and give meaning to, instead of something that we're constantly pathologizing and stigmatizing?
Yes, thank you. I don't know if you want to respond as well, John. One thing I would say just to you is I couldn't help but think that in the photos that those beautiful photos, there was these kind of, the photos themselves were kind of scenes of reading. So we had text or other images like that were kind of being watched or being read in all of those photos. It's just something that came to mind.
Yeah, it's a really nice observation, and it can be a way back into your question, right? Because the space between is so essential to my thinking. I mean, my last book is titled The Decision Between Us. I mean, it's very much about this betweenness. I mean, it's a little bit different than Arendt's because it picks up on other ways of dealing with Arendt that people like Jean-Luc Nancy have done, right? But in any event, the point would be that like love, art, poetry, aesthetics of various kinds betray relation. They betray that betweenness. They keep it open. They keep it inappropriable, right? That's what I meant by inappropriable. That space between is a space that is neither yours nor mine. It has to be kept open. And the ethical decision, which is, the decision itself is a space of separation, etymologically speaking. The ethical decision is to share and decide how to sustain and keep open that space between and not appropriate it. And I guess I would just say again that what art does that by betraying the way in which that betweenness can become a relation, by saying it's actually not a relation, right? It's an exposure to the outside that we can share together. And that's what art, poetry, literature, love, intimacy, that's why the next book is called The Intimacy of the Outside, right? It is a different kind of way of thinking about that. So that's all I would say. Yeah.
John, can I pose a question just in response to that to you? I'm curious, given your work, how you would think about the kind of inner experience that Bataille describes in relationship to our experience with aesthetic objects that doesn't constitute a relationship with the world outside of ourselves because it's the negation of projects, but turns us inward to a form of self-sovereignty.
Right. Although at that point, I also then read it as kind of a cognate to my phrase, the intimacy of the outside, that there is still a way in which it is an exposure for Bataille, that even that thing that he calls inner experience is not the kind of bourgeois psychological interiority that
Yes.
we,
Yes.
right? It's this other kind of sovereign,
Yes.
as you say, right, in Bataille's sense of sovereignty, again, a non-appropriating, expropriating self-sovereignty that keeps one open. Yeah.
Hmm.
Does that make sense? That would be the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would love to talk with you more about it, but I won't.
Yeah, me too.
Not now.
So we had a question from Aoife who had her hand up, and then we can relay Elspeth's question afterwards. You should be able to, yeah, you're unmuted, Aoife.
Hi, by the way, I'm impressed you pronounced my name. Thank you. My question is for Dr. Hill, if I may. Towards the end of your talk, you mentioned the productive capacity of loneliness versus solitude. I was wondering if you had intentionally diverged from Arendt with that understanding, because my understanding is that loneliness in Arendt has no productive capacity because it is the complete dissolution of alterity and plurality. She even says communication is not possible, I think, in Origins.
Yes.
Yes, so that's my question.
Do I break up with Hannah Arendt in my work on loneliness? Spoiler alert. I am diverging from Arendt there. So one of the things that I think, there are a few different things, but there are a few different ways to kind of work through it. Arendt is talking about a very specific form of loneliness, which is political loneliness, which she names conceptually organized loneliness. And that is a loneliness in modernity that is about the atomization of the masses, which is isolating and prevents thinking, prevents for her, importantly, the two-in-one dialogue of self-reflective thinking, makes it impossible to engage in any kind of creative or productive activity, makes it impossible to form meaningful relationships with other people because we're isolated in fear against one another, and makes us susceptible to ideology, which offers simple solutions to complex problems. So she's talking about this form of political loneliness, which is instrumentalized through political propaganda to affect a person's relationship with the world around them and themselves. So it's about, for her, the way that we relate to our senses and the experience of thinking self-reflectively that we have with ourselves and our ability to make decisions on our own. Arendt doesn't offer a kind of, she doesn't offer an affective account of loneliness. I don't think that we can disavow loneliness as an affective experience. And I think for me, loneliness as an affective experience is important to the ethical dimensions of loneliness that we should take into account. I think Arendt also falls prey, although it's the other way around, because it's part of the collapse between social isolation and loneliness. And other scholars like Shayla Ben-Habib have written about this, is that part of Arendt's argument is that there was the complete breakdown of society in Origins, which meant the negation of all social networks and ties. But other scholars have shown that that actually wasn't the case either. And so the third part is that Arendt is not using the word loneliness. She's using this word Verlassenheit, which means abandonness. And it's a sense of feeling abandoned into the world. Heidegger's term for that, who he's a bit present in her account here, is geworfen, right? To be kind of thrown, abandoned into the world. Although she actually takes that back later on, just for fun, in one of her thinking notebooks. She says, Heidegger says we were thrown into the world. Heidegger was wrong. I think it's the only place where she writes Heidegger was wrong. But it's this sense of being completely uprooted. And so when Arendt's talking about rootlessness, homelessness, and abandonness, or loneliness in the way that she's using it, she's talking about the existential conditions of modernity and the feeling of displacement of the masses. And so she is also appealing to that secular conception of loneliness that emerged in the 19th century, but she's really pulling it from Nietzsche and thinking about what it means to be at home in the world, and what it means for the Jewish people to have lost their home physically, metaphysically, existentially, to no longer have language, to no longer have a job, the social ties, community. She's talking about the loneliness of the Jewish people and the loneliness of refugees who are abandoned into the world with the collapse of the nation state and the emergence of totalitarianism. But in my work and in what I'm writing, I think that it's very important to offer both a political account of loneliness, but also to attend to the private and social dimensions of loneliness as well. And I think the personal experience of loneliness is related to, but different from, ultimately, the political Verlassenheit of organized loneliness that Arendt is talking about. And the other side of that for me is her, taking into account the shifting historical and material conditions as they unfold over time. The landscape of our world today in the 21st century is very different than the landscape of the mid 20th century. So that was a long answer, but
thank you.
Yeah, yes.
We probably just have time for one final question, which is the one that Elspeth has relayed, so has put into the chat. So let me just repeat it if that's okay. So it's a question for John. Picking up on the references to Love, Munoz, and Edelman around queer temporalities, can you elaborate a bit more about your take on queer temporality in relationship to solitude or solidarity?
Okay, thank you, Elspeth, my dear friend Elspeth, for that question. I did not mention any of those names, but she was able, of course, to it, that those are exactly the names I was implicitly referring to. So here's the long and short of it, because we've got like 2 minutes left. All of them think about all of them use a historical paradigm, use a paradigm of history. They're not thinking in terms of time and temporality the way I am, right? And as they do their work, they're only thinking in terms of that which can be historicized, either in terms of the past, the present, or the future. They're thinking in terms of chronological time, if they are thinking about time. And what I'm trying to do is to think about this thing that I call the kairos moment, the opportune moment, the eruption, the interruption, to think it as the contemporary, and to think about it as that which cannot be historicized, that which actually, what's funny about so much of queer theory is that it's supposed to be talking about desire, and desire is the impossibility of historicization, right? It is this thing that erupts out of narrative, it's the betrayal of narrative. If you're going to narrativize it, it's going to be melodrama. We don't want that. So, right, there's just this other way then of thinking about it. I have more in the paper. I didn't have time to present it. That would have fleshed this out a little bit more in terms of a present that is not the present of a past, present, future chronology, but the present as a kind of coming, the coming of the present, a jouissance of the present, again, to pick up on Nancy and others. The other thing about all of this is that it needs to be able to think time and temporality outside of the human, which they can't do. So to think in terms of the inhuman, and not just in terms of life, but in terms of the unlivable, which is what I'm also interested in. So all of that, I couldn't be further from them. Yeah. How is that for
Really?
a race to the finish?
Incredibly impressive. John, one final question we had was just if you could potentially just write into the chat or the name of the photographer whose images you showed.
Oh, yes. And I want to thank Dean for providing me with the images and being so wonderful to work with as I embark on this part of the project, and his enthusiasm for it and support. So that's Dean Samshima. He's an American artist, Japanese American artist who lives in Berlin.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. I'm glad to learn about his work. So yeah, I can only say now thanks so much to John and to Sam for these papers, which I was really astounded by, and I think I learned so much from both of them. yeah, and I have a lot more to think about after hearing them, and a lot to follow up on. Jess, I don't know if you wanted to say anything just at the end of this series at all.
Yeah, I want to extend my thanks to for three wonderful papers, and I loved how they spoke to each other in such kind of rich ways. And it seemed at the end there was this defining kind of thread of like humanity, and I was thinking also of the humanities, of the ways in which kind of loneliness was opening up these questions from kind of Arendt and questions of homelessness. I was thinking of statelessness, and to John Paul's wonderful phrase, the ethical solidarity of the other, of what it means to be kind of alone and to have kind of lived through these years. So thank you so much for those beautiful papers, and to return to kind of Sam's idea of kind of, you know, getting involved in these loneliness events. It's been great to be kind of lonely in company. And for that, I'm so grateful to Dr. Rebecca Fisher, Becky, who's from the English Association, who's made all this possible. So it's really been kind of wonderful this end. And I know that there has been a lot of good reception of these events. So I'm delighted that you've been able to kind of host these as part of the English Association, and that it's we've created such a rich dialogue for this important conversation. So for everyone that is left in the digital room, to please give our speakers and Dr. Becky Fisher a round of applause, if you're able to unmute yourself for some. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Bye.